Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 74. Today's guest is Franny Choi. Hey there, folks. Today's show is a conversation with poet Franny Choi. Franny Choi is the author of the full-length collection Floating Brilliant Gone and the chapbook Death by Sex Machine. She has been a finalist for multiple national poetry slams, and her poems have appeared in Poetry Magazine, American Poetry Review, the New England Review, and elsewhere. She is a Kundiman Fellow, a senior news editor for Hyphen, co-host of the podcast Versus, and a member of the Dark Noise Collective. Her second collection, Soft Science, is forthcoming in April 2019 from Alice James Books. My first experience with Franny's poetry was a couple of years ago when I saw a video that was going around of her For Peter Liang poem. This poem, you might remember back in 2016, the conviction of Peter Liang, an NYPD officer, for the shooting of Akai Gurley, an unarmed black man. Around the time of Liang's conviction, there was a lot of protesting happening from Chinese American organizations, and I was having a hard time with it. I felt like there was something wrong about those protests, something that didn't sit right with me, but I didn't know how to articulate it. And then I saw Franny's reading of this poem, and it just, well, it affected me. It helped. I didn't know who she was yet, but I said, this is it. Fast forward a bit over a year to the summer of 2017, and I heard about this new poetry podcast that was about to come out called Versus, hosted by Dinez Smith and Franny Choi, and I thought, yes, I need to check that out. And it rapidly became one of my favorite podcasts. Every episode features a great conversation between Dinez, Franny, and their guests, and conversations that go deep into process and deep into the work, but which are also just so energetic and fun to listen to. And that was the point at which I really started following Franny's poetry. So fast forward again to this past spring when I read Franny's chapbook, Death by Sex Machine, which was just tremendous. And here Franny uses a framing concept of artificial intelligence, and specifically through android characters from the movie Ex Machina and the manga Chobits. She uses this frame to look at voicelessness, dehumanization, Asian fetishism, the nature of agency, and a whole bunch more. And it's just, well, I mean, there's a lot going on in these poems, both thematically and formally. So, of course, I knew I wanted to talk with her about this book. Now, I put links in the show notes to where you can purchase both Death by Sex Machine and her previous collection, Floating Brilliant Gone, as well as where you can pre-order her forthcoming collection, Soft Science, which, as I mentioned, is coming out in April of next year. So please do check those out. I've also put a link to Versus, which just returned for a new season a couple of weeks ago. Their latest episode features a conversation with Nate Marshall and is outstanding, so do check that out as well. One more thing before we get started. For subscribers to the KTCO Patreon campaign, there is a new bonus reading available. Franny Choi reading her poem, Oh My God, How Does It Feel to Be Korean Right Now? That joins our growing bonus archive, which includes readings from poets Natalie Eilbert and Ailey Moan, and which is available to Patreon subscribers at any level. If you'd like to make a pledge, you can do that at patreon.com/sakeriver. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag #ChannelOpenPoetry to live tweet the episode. And now, here's my conversation with Franny Choi. Okay, so I was wondering if we could start with a poem.
Yeah, sure. So I'll read this poem called The Price of Rain, which is in the chapbook, Death by Sex Machine, as well as the book that's coming out in the spring. I guess I'm not sure if there's anything I should say as any sort of intro, except that in thinking about like the Me Too movement and all of these current conversations about sexual violence, that I think it forces everyone to like reflect really heavily on their own experiences with intimacy, and intimacy is just like hard. I don't know, I guess maybe the poem is kind of returning through my own memories of intimacy and trying to figure out like what role power has played. I guess maybe that's sort of a theme generally of my work. But anyway, here it is. The Price of Rain. The truth is that no man has taken anything I didn't give him. I mean, no man has taken anything I claimed as my own. My body, my stink, my land to plant in. It's never been about the price of lettuce. How many times have I taken something that did not belong to me? Queen, queen, I croon, pulling up handfuls of greens. My, property's still theft. I let my wet skin slip through the drain pipe. My mother says love in our family means sacrifice. I thought if I lay my legs on the altar, I thought something would come back to me. Mine. I offered it, being promised rain, being told my wet was in the common domain. I whispered, our body, our legs, our compost heap. I gave freely. I gave it for free, thinking that made me winged, stork, delivering herself to herself. Look how free I am, dowager slut, queen regent. Turns out there are no synonyms for king, my lord, my darling, my darkening sky. You can't buy a thunderstorm, nor should you bring one back from the dead. But I threw open the gates. I invited them in. I said, help yourselves, then watched as they went room to room, taking, emptying the shelves, sucking marrow from the bones, and overhead the sky filled with rain.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. That particular poem was one that kind of stuck out for me in this collection, that I was thinking a little bit about how so much of this chapbook is about these characters that you're inhabiting that sort of lack agency, or at least they're sort of made to lack agency. Mm-hmm. And yet it feels like this particular poem is really interested in the idea of agency, especially in the context of sexuality and intimacy.
Yeah, for sure.
Does that seem about right?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that, agency is so tricky no matter what in our daily lives. You know, I don't know. I think the question, maybe the larger question that the book, and maybe like any media about artificial intelligence is trying to ask, might be like, do any of us have agency? Like, are any of us actually have free will? Is it all programming? And I think that process of trying to parse out, what did I decide to do? What was I coerced into doing? What was I like destined to do because of, you know, the ways that I've been programmed by the world or by like a literal programmer. Yeah, those questions become maybe like heightened when it comes, or just like pulled into sharper focus when you're talking about sex, talking about intimacy, right? So the more I think about robots and sex in the same room, the more I like understand why they're in the same room to begin with, you know? But yeah, so I guess this is a poem that maybe also like doesn't explicitly have any robots in it, but it's also like there's that like interruptive voice. Like if you see the text of the poem, there's a lot of text like in italics, like that line, it's never been about the price of lettuce, which I know is sort of like a weird curveball, and I still don't totally understand what it's doing in there either, but I think so, like for me, a lot of what gives this poem momentum as I'm looking through it and reading it is what those different voices in it are saying to each other, and like the process of trying to parse them out, which makes me think of, you know, like scenes in Westworld when Dolores is trying to understand what part of her inner voice is Ford and what's her, et cetera, you know?
Yeah. There's like a whole bunch of things that you just said that I wanted to sort of follow up on. Let me see, what would be maybe the first, I think, you know, the maybe the most interesting thing that you just said is that about that line, it's never been about the price of lettuce, that you still weren't sure completely what that was doing in there. I think that is a fascinating sort of way of like peek inside the poet's mind, maybe, that like, I think a lot of people have this impression that poetry is a thing that is to be understood, you know, but if even the poet isn't completely sure what the meaning is, like that's sort of an interesting proposition.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's definitely, well, I guess the first thing is that I do think that that idea that a poem is meant to be totally understood, like that has like a historical basis, right? Like that in a lot of ways comes from new criticism and this wave of literary criticism that looks at poetry as like a thing to be parsed, you know, like that's
Hmm.
where our like contemporary close reading practices that are like so drilled in school, you know, for some good reason. That's sort of like where they come from. So that hasn't always been the way that we approach poetry, or that we like see poetry as like, you know, needing to be approached. At the same time, I also think like the idea that you should just listen and not understand and that's okay. That's also like a philosophy that maybe like keeps people away from poetry too, you know,
Hmm.
like why listen to a poem if there's nothing to get out of it and it's just sort of like sparkles slash like, you know, like maybe it's just like a waste of time if it's just like if it's like this like weird Emperor's New Clothes game of people like looking at a poem and everyone being like, wow, amazing. And then you sitting there being like, what the fuck? You know, like I'm sure that like that performance, like I know from my own experience that that performance does a lot of work to drive people away from poetry.
Hmm.
That said, like I also, so like with those two poles in mind, I also like, I think the moments for me in a poem that resonate but don't make sense, or that like I wouldn't have thought to put there, that's for me is like where a lot of the aliveness of a poem comes from, actually.
Hmm.
Because it makes total sense. That means like the algorithm would have eventually gotten you there or something, you know, like then there's nothing to it. I mean, it becomes predictable, put simply, you know. And
Yeah.
so I think there have to be some moments that are off or that are weird or yeah, that don't make sense.
Yeah, yeah. I would, you know, I've mentioned this particular quotation on the show before, not that long ago actually, but I think about sometimes there was a thing that Kava Akbar said in an interview. Not, I think it was maybe a couple months ago that I heard it. He was saying that poetry, like even if you can't, what was he trying to say? He made some reference to like hearing a conversation through a wall, that even if you don't know what every word is, you can still glean the meaning from the sort of cadences and the tone of voice and things like that, and that poetry can do something similar. For
Yeah.
me, I thought at the same time, what, oh, that's brilliant, but also it felt a little unsatisfying to me because I feel like oftentimes for me what it is that I don't necessarily need to understand every single allusion or literary reference, and rather what's important to me is how the poem makes me feel. But I also want to know why I feel the way that I feel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, and I think that's exactly the balance, right? Like of how much to like how much understanding is necessary to be like satisfying to a reader, to make it feel like the work is worth it. And maybe the trouble is that that answer is going to be different for different readers, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. So I don't I don't really know what to do with that. And also like I love that idea of like listening to a conversation through a wall. But also like that isn't how poems are. I mean like poems are written to be overheard, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's like it's like it, maybe if I could add something to that, it would be like two people, I don't know, like rehearsing for a play or something, or
Mm.
like two people like who are having a conversation about some like shady stuff, who are pretty sure that the person next to them might be listening, you
Right.
know? So
Right.
like,
Right.
how does that change like what you want people to overhear?
Going back to something else that you said about the price of rain, when you were talking about these italicized portions, you talked about the importance of voice and sort of using different voices in this particular poem. But then again, that's also something that's very integral to the collection as a whole, the chapbook as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
because of the fact that you're pretty explicitly in some of the poems, but I guess like who the I of the poem is you know, sort of changes as you go through the collection. Sometimes it's explicitly these like a character from Ex Machina, the movie, or a character from this manga Chobits that I'm actually not familiar with that one, but it's interesting what you're doing with these different voices. And I guess sort of one of the things that I was thinking about with this is how, you know, on the one hand, using these different characters, these different voices really activates these things that you're talking about in a really interesting and in a way that I'm not sure I've really seen exactly the same way before. But also it's interesting because of the fact that the characters that you're inhabiting here are ones that explicitly don't have voices of their own. So I thought that was a really interesting thing that you were doing here.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, writing in persona is always weird and tricky. And I think like there's a lot of room for, this has been on my mind actually, the question of like, of inhabiting a persona in a poem, because there have been conversations among my friends and like kind of like our larger community of poets lately in the past like day or so about this poem that was published. I don't know if you saw it. Yeah. And it's like particularly weird because he's a person who like a poet who's kind of like in the sort of extended community of like Twin Cities poetry. So it's been like sort of tricky to try to like navigate how to talk about it, I think. But so, I mean, I don't want to like spend my hour like shading this poet, but like what it, you know, just to like give anyone who's listening like context, there was this poem that was inhabiting a persona, and I think a lot of people were pretty offended by the result of that, because the writer is like a upper middle class like white male person, and the poem was maybe using it's sort of hard to exactly say, but like African American vernacular English and like maybe a homeless person who's panhandling, and so, you know, there's obviously like a lot of political stakes in speaking for a character who embodies like a really different subject position in regards to like race and class than you know, and especially like to use that in order to be published in a really prestigious journal, you know, like that just is like sort of shitty. But there was something that D. Matthews, the poet Era D. Matthews, said. It was just like a really succinct way of I'm gonna sort of butcher it, but basically she was saying like what makes persona interesting is like the way that the poet and then the character, like the thread of oneness that like is like drawn between the poet and the character, what it is that puts them in conversation in the first place, and then what happens when those voices are collapsed into one, and the sort of like tensions and vibrations that come out of that. And if that thread in the first place was nothing or was flimsy, then the result is often like a flattening, or it doesn't work, or it becomes parody, is what she said. And so I feel like, well, it's weird because these characters that I'm embodying, like in these poems, Kyoko, character from the movie Ex Machina, who is a robot. I guess that's sort of a spoiler. Maybe I should stop saying that.
The movie's been out for a while. It's probably okay.
Yeah. Who's a robot who has no language, who doesn't speak. And then also Chi from Chobits, who is like a broken android, and so she can only make the sound chi, and so is essentially also languageless. You know, there's a lot of reasons that brought me to inhabiting their voices, and also a lot of things that make us like very different, you know, like one of the biggest ones being that like they're both like Japanese or Japanese American. I don't really. It's hard to say like what race like an android is, but
certainly they present as Asian though. They
present as Asian, and they both have Japanese names. And so, as a Korean American, there are politics of like taking a Japanese woman's voice that I haven't like fully addressed and haven't fully like worked out. And then there's also, like anytime I think somebody says like, it says in a poem, I'm going to give a voice to the voiceless. Like like a million warning flags come up in my head. So I was like, those things make it kind of nerve wracking, I think, for me to speak as Kyoko and as Chi.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you're sort of getting at, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're getting at in both the case of this other poem that everybody was talking about yesterday and this morning for good reason, and in the case of your own poems, is that when you write a personal poem, that had like the act of writing a poem or making art of any kind has consequences, and you can't divorce those consequences from the dynamics of power between the person writing the poem or making the art and the voice that they're inhabiting. And it seems like with this poem that was that everyone was talking about, that's problematic because of the way that the man who was speaking is speaking from a position of quite a lot of privilege and power compared to the voice that he's inhabiting. Whereas, I mean, I guess there's a conversation to be had about computers and robots and things like that and how much power they have. But to begin with, these voices, these characters that you're inhabiting here are fictional.
Right.
So it's a pretty different proposition, it seems to me.
Totally. And there's not like a history of like disenfranchising robots because of their access to certain kinds of English. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So like, there's just, there's less there. And I think like the thing with the other poem, in The Nation was also, a critique that I saw a lot that what I thought was like really valid and lively, was like critiquing the poet's like obvious misunderstanding of that kind of English, of African American vernacular. Like, people were saying like, why would you say, why would you use a contraction here but not here? Like, you obviously like don't speak this,
Yeah.
And so maybe like part of my interest in like speaking like Kyoko is really trying to imagine like what is the kind of English that someone like Kyoko would speak, like how, especially because that it doesn't exist, knowing that like perhaps no one exactly knows how she would speak, like that's a language that doesn't exist yet exactly, like a vernacular that doesn't yet exist, and so trying to like use my own relationship to English and being like I guess my Korean was my first language, but it's all blended together now. But, using my experience, my background with English to kind of inform like the way that I might imagine a new vernacular.
Yeah. It really does seem like the key thing here with a persona poem, and really for any kind of art that makes use of a subject other than oneself, that the key thing is being able to understand the person or the thing that you're making the art out of, and that was the key lack in this other person's poem. Whereas, these poems that you've put into this chapbook, they're very empathetic poems, which actually is sort of an interesting concept of having empathy, which we normally think of as being, the quality of being able to understand someone else's emotions or experiences or things like that. Applying that to an artificial intelligence is, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of different things that are interesting about that.
I think it makes for some weird nights at the laptop, I mean, it is like a strange experiment, I think, in like trying to extend empathy or sort of, maybe not extend empathy, but like understand how like ask how our understanding of empathy necessarily needs to change when we're talking about like non-human subjects, right? Like can't, like what does it mean to have empathy for, I mean, also this also goes for like non-human animals too. Like what does it mean to like have empathy for a cow if we know that we'll never like, but it doesn't really make sense to try to like be like, how would a cow feel, and like feel the way a cow would feel, like because that's not really like, maybe that's just like not the right question to be asking, you know. And yeah, but and at the same time, I also think that like anytime we make, like humans make a thing that's like sort of human, but like definitely not, whenever we like dip into that uncanny valley that people talk about, like the question is like, what does that do to like fuck up your sense of empathy and your understanding of that, you know?
Yeah.
Like, because our natural inclination to be like, it's a human, like I'm a human, like here we go. But when that's obviously impossible or obviously nonsensical, then like, what do we do with that information? Like, do we then say like, great, now is the time to like, to thrust all of the violence that I've always wanted to, you know, do onto humans, but was never allowed to, like onto this thing? Or do we change the way we look at all beings, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I felt like the poems in this book were really operating on multiple levels, but two of the ones that I was sort of thinking of had to do with, you know, when we talk about understanding these characters, you know, that on the one hand, in a more literal sense, just what we were just talking about, taking them as the characters that they are, being artificial intelligences, and thinking about what our relationship to technology is and how the concept of, I think you've even talked about this on Versus before, about how, you know, it's a little troubling to think about what our relationship to machines might be, especially given our history of things like settler colonialism and slavery and things like that. What all of that, you know, sort of unpacking all of that. Just so that was one level, you know, the sort of literal, our relationship to machines level. But then also because of the fact that these characters are, they present as Asian women, that they function really effectively as a metaphor for at least the Asian American woman experience in some ways. And it does feel like you're doing things with that as well, unless I'm misreading it. I don't know.
Oh yeah, of course. You know, I think seeing a movie like Ex Machina was like the reason that I'm writing about robots is exactly because I was writing about and thinking about race and gender. And so when like that character showed up on the screen, I was sort of like, you know, it was sort of like, oh, like here is like the concrete, like here's the image, you know, like I've been like using lots of different images and like not even the image, but here's the like the vehicle, or the like playpen for continuing to think about these things. That was always what first drew me to thinking about artificial intelligence. And then what I, maybe something that opened up for me was that questions of violence when it comes to race and gender were always questions of consciousness and of humanity, and, you know, who gets to be categorized as human, and you know, what is an object, and what do you do when you like wake up one day and are like, hello world, and you're somewhere in between human and object, you know? I think the thing that was so compelling about like kind of like turning around and noticing all of the like Asian female robots that are in media was how sort of like unsurprising it was. You look at it, it makes sense, like why that would be the race and gender of the like android in front of you. And then the question is like, okay, like why does that make so much sense, right? And I think that maybe sort of goes back to this idea of strangeness and incongruency in poetry, you know? I think that what makes me want to do that work is how it seems to make sense, but I don't understand how. That makes me then want to ask the question, like, okay, like how, like, what is it about this image that I see in front of me, or this line I see in front of me that resonates, even if I've never like thought of that before.
Yeah. So, as you're saying that, something that sort of occurs to me is the depictions in those two things. Like I said, I'm not actually familiar with the Chobits manga, but I have some experience with anime and manga, and I did see Ex Machina. It's sort of interesting to think about how, the thing that stands out, of course, in these poems is how neither of these characters have their own literal voice, literal ability to express themselves. But one of the things that occurs to me is that Ex Machina is an American movie depicting this Asian presenting character, whereas a manga is going to be something that where the Asianness, because it's originating, the media property is originating in an Asian country, the Asianness of that character isn't going to be an exotic or othering kind of thing in the same way that it is certainly presented that way in Ex Machina. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. That's something that like was sort of like on my mind too when like the poems that I write that are like where I'm clearly both speaking about like in the narrative world of Chobits, and also like doing a commentary about violence against people of color and women of color specifically, for sure. And also though, I think especially when it comes to, maybe not especially when it comes to Japanese pop culture, but I mean, the shit is also like more global than we might expect or realize, or I don't know. Like Japanese pop culture's fascination with like transhumanness and cyborg figures and artificial intelligence, et cetera, like that also kind of helps, I think, the American imagination to code those things as like particularly Asian as well, like, I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe like an easy way out might be like it's a manga and an anime series that has like made it to the US and is like my vantage point is as an American, like looking at this and then like forming my ideas about Asianness based on this manga, So, right. Like I think like the way like the weird, the like fucked up Japanese art is like, used to kind of like further cement the idea that East Asian people are like foreign and strange and fucked up and like sick in the head and et cetera. Like, it's also part of like this American project as well,
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it's also, what that brings up for me is how, in America, the differences between different kinds of Asian people, I mean, not even just the differences between, there's been some talk recently about disaggregating East Asians from, say, Southeast Asians, South Asians, or Pacific Islanders. And I certainly think that's a really interesting and necessary conversation to have, even just within East Asians. Though, I mean, the history between Japan and Korea, Japan and China, Korea and China, like these are separate entities with very complicated and complex histories and power dynamics and relationships between themselves. And then those have played out to some degree, but in a different way between the diasporic communities in America from those countries. You're Korean American. These characters are coded as Japanese. I'm Japanese American for myself. I feel like there's this way in which America, being in America gives us both an opportunity for solidarity among Asian Americans as a bloc, but also erases the differences between us, which is troubling.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, I think that's like one of the central questions of Asian American organizing in general. And I think it makes a lot of sense also to highlight that if like those differences are tricky for Korean and Japanese American communities organizing in the US, like those gulfs and the work necessary to for like real solidarity, or like even wider between, say, a Korean American and like a Samoan American person trying to talk about what it means to be like API together, right? And like, you know, even that term API is one that I think is also under, you know, is also like kind of being contested as like whether it is really a necessary or like a term or like grouping, or not even necessary. Like there are things that I think are like materially necessary about like having Pacific Islanders included in larger conversations about like people coming from that part of the world. But you know, like, yeah, it's also complicated to be like API. For example, like your organization staff is like all East Asian and like one South Asian or something, you know, like, what is it? What currency do Asian American spaces gain from like putting PI into their names? And like what actually comes back to Pacific Islander American folks that they're supposed to serve? You know, like that. Yeah, that question is also huge. But even when it comes down to like, you know, two countries who are right next to each other, yeah, like the history of colonialism in Korea by Japan, by the Japanese Empire, is like, it just makes for some complicated friendships here, like a few generations and an ocean later, you know?
Yeah, definitely. There's like a million more things that I would love to talk about, but I think that we need to take a little break, and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Sweet. Awesome.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Oh, this is, yeah. Ooh, I don't really know. I mean, I just spent like a month in Korea, this summer. And so I could talk about Korea and specifically like Korean food all day. I could talk about Korean food any day of the week.
I'm always down to talk about some Korean food or anything. So yeah, let's hear about some Korean food.
Yeah. Well, you know, like you know how like the thing that people always say, the like very common knowledge that like Chinese food is like so diverse and like every province has its own kind of food, and like it all gets flattened into this one like thing in the US, which is like, you know, that history is like super, super fascinating. Mm-hmm. But something I realized when I was in Korea this summer was that also happens though on like a smaller, like a much smaller scale with Korean food. Like, you know, you go into any Korean restaurant and it's really like the same like 12 dishes. And those 12 dishes are things that like people eat in Korea, like very much so. It's not exactly like there's this like whole other, there's not like exactly like a General Tso's chicken equivalent, I think, when it comes to Korean food. But like there were so many different things. There's so many different like kinds of food, you know, on one block in, you know, Hongdae or something in Seoul that you would never find on a menu. And this is the first time also going to Korea that I was like really traveling around outside of Seoul and like realized that like Gyeongsangdo food is different and like Jeollado food is different and Jeju-do food is different. Like, and my mind was blown that there could be so much food diversity within this tiny, tiny peninsula of a country.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I think, what that's making me think of, I mean, just in general, how, you know, America has this tendency of really narrowing how it views and presents other cultures in basically every way. But food is definitely one that it does that with. I mean, it does it with Chinese food. It does it with Korean food. It does it with Japanese food. It does it with Indian food. I work with a whole bunch of people from different parts of India who, and my area of San Diego is the area with all of the Indian restaurants in it. But my coworkers that are from India are always saying, you know, like, it's not really like that. But then, you know, somebody else might say, well, actually, it is kind of like that where I'm from, but, you know, it wouldn't be like that in New Delhi. So I don't know. There's something kind of about that, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I think like maybe in when it comes to Korean food, it's less about like geographic, like more geographic diversity when it comes to food and more like I don't know. I guess that like every Korean restaurant in the US, I think like feels this burden of representing, like kind of like the greatest hits of Korean food.
Hmm.
Um, and restaurants in Korea are so specialized. Like, and I think that has to, like Seoul, I feel like, I don't actually know the numbers on this, but I feel like Seoul has like, I mean, first of all, it's one of like the densest cities in the world. I think it's denser than Tokyo.
Mm.
And it's like the restaurants per capita is bananas. Like there's just like two layers of restaurants in some neighborhoods. Just like I feel like there's as many restaurants as there are like people, or maybe it's like as many as there are like women or something. It's wild. And so of course every restaurant has to be, but that means that like on this block there's like 6 different places that are specifically fried chicken spots, and like 4 that are specializing in scallion pancakes, or like who that have like really good pancakes and makgeolli. And so I don't know. I guess like I don't really know. I don't really have like a political therefore conclusion to this, except that like I don't know. Everyone should go to Korea if you like Korean food, and especially like a lot of street food and stuff. Most of my memories of being abroad are of eating.
That's the best thing to do, really. I mean, just in general in life, I think, I don't know. I think when you're talking about how every Korean restaurant in the United States feels like it has to present the greatest hits, I mean, what that's really speaking to, right, is the idea that these restaurants are kind of more facing white people than they are facing Korean people or even Asian people in general, which, obviously in Korea, they wouldn't have that same sort of burden of trying to attract a white audience.
Yeah, no, you just want people in there because the food is like really good, you know?
Yeah. I find, here in San Diego, I grew up in a very small town in Northern California that was very, very white. And there were not a lot of Asian restaurants in general, and there certainly were no Korean restaurants. And then since I've moved to San Diego, the part of San Diego that I live in is like heavily Vietnamese and Filipino. And then right next door to my neighborhood is this area where all of the different Asian and especially Korean businesses are. I find it really interesting that when you go into a restaurant in the neighborhood's called Kearny Mesa, and when you go to a restaurant in Kearny Mesa, like what's interesting to me is that not all of the Korean restaurants are exactly the same. Like some of them, there is actually, I mean, there's only one, so it's not like 6 on the same blocks, but there is a restaurant that's just Korean fried chicken.
Yeah. Well, that's one that I think has come over, like that might be like the one like Korean special. Although I guess like sundubu, like the soft tofu stew, like there are also like in LA and New York and stuff, and Atlanta where my family's from.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's like a few of them, but there's not like, I've never seen like a 닭갈비 place in the US, like it's just like chicken. But yeah, but fried chicken, the Korean fried chicken has come, but that's also like, I mean, it's not exactly it's not a new thing, like Korean fried chicken, but I think like it's like like fried chicken exists all over the world. Like you'll like eat, everyone will eat fried chicken. Even it's a sort of like a global, it's like a very, it's a food that can cross borders. And so maybe like these days it's like, it has sort of like come over into the US and into American knowledge. Although like Korean chicken, I think something I learned recently was that my grandfather owned like a fried chicken place, like way back in the day. So, and I thought that the Korean fried chicken thing was like a recent invention, but apparently it's in my roots, deep in my family history.
It's sort of weird, like being faced with things having to revise your conception of either your family or even your culture in certain ways when you presented with new things like that.
Oh, totally. And And like, I think that's something that I learned a lot on this trip too, both about my family and about Korea and Korean people in general, as if like you can learn anything about like such a big thing, but that people are always changing and they're always dynamic. Like, you know, I used to think of my parents as like super strict and like traditional. And the more I got older, I realized that like, that's actually it's not exactly true. Like they, you know, I guess there are certain things about the way that they like raised me that are that way, but kind of like understanding the context of where my parents came from, I realized, like, you know, in talking to like my cousins and my aunts and stuff, I was like, oh no, my parents are like the weirdos of the family, you know, like I mean, and of course that makes sense. They're the ones who left. They're the ones who like left and went to America for, you know, like not exactly chasing adventure, but I think you have to kind of have like an adventurous spirit to like go to the other side of the world, even if it's like necessity that drives you there. And also like when it came to, like I went to a gay bar in Busan and, you know, was talking to like some of the bartenders there. And I think I asked like, what is it like, like this like ridiculous question of like, what is it like to be gay in Korea? Which is like, how could anybody answer such a question? And, you know, I kind of expected it to be like, oh, it's like, you know, it's really hard and that's why we have the space. It's so sacred to us or something. And the person was like, I don't know, it's okay. Like, like it's hard for some people. And, you know, my parents are like cool. So like, it kind of just depends on your family and I don't know, it's complicated. And like, I kept running into those things where I would like ask someone a question, like expecting to like have my understanding of Korean culture confirmed. And then like for people to be like, I don't know, shit is always changing and it depends on who you ask, like, which is so obvious and so human.
Yeah.
Strange to experience extending that, like, that kind of empathy and like understanding of individuality to my own people, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird. I think, you know, being, like, I don't know, you said you grew up in Atlanta. I don't really know what Atlanta is like in terms of having a lot of Koreans or Asians or whatever. Where I grew up, I mean, just to start with, America in general, I mean, Asians make up a tiny percentage of the population here. Where I grew up, it was even more. So the town I grew up in was so white that basically the only Asian people I knew were like my family and maybe one or two other kids. And I think that it's been a weird thing for me moving from that town to a city like San Diego where there are a lot of Asian people. I feel like the experience is very different. I feel like there's something about the way that it sort of opens up when you can know for yourself that being part of a culture doesn't imply something about that culture being monolithic. You can know that even when it's just your own family, but it's a different experience when you're actually faced with a whole lot of people who look like you, who are nothing like you.
Yeah. I mean, what was it? It was in Maxine on Kingston and like Woman Warrior where she said like, I can't tell what's Chinese and what's just my family. And I like that. Yeah, that totally speaks to the kind of isolation that immigrant families, you know, like kids growing up in immigrant families experience, like being like, and I think that's why like the trip, you know, back to the motherland can be such a disorienting thing, you know, to be like, oh, like I thought that all Koreans did this, but it's actually just like my mom. She's like the only one, you know? Yeah. Super weird.
Yeah, no, it is weird. It's very weird. I've never been to Japan before. People keep telling me that I need to, and I honestly am a little intimidated by it all. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, I mean, and especially like to go and then, I mean, I think like people don't really know what to do with, I mean, and of course, again, I'm going to be like, not all Koreans, but like, you know, I think like a lot of Koreans were like, okay, white person, like foreigner, got it. And then they'd look at me and be like, Korean. And then I'd start speaking and they'd be like, Korean? And then after a while it was like, oh, American. But like, there's like a period in there where it's like, why is this person so confused about something that's so obvious? And then like, it must be fascinating as like a Korean to like think about, to like encounter a Korean American and try to figure out what's going on there. You know, like what part of Korean culture has like transferred, you know, over all that distance.
Yeah.
What is it that makes someone like American?
Yeah. For me, like my family's been in this country for a really long time. Like my family's actually been in this country longer than my wife. My wife is white, and her family's been here for like, well, her mom is actually an immigrant, and her dad is like her grandparents on the other side are immigrants. So, but like for me, I have great grandparents that were born here, so it's that level of removal from, like, not only can I not speak Japanese, but my parents can't speak Japanese, and three of my grandparents can't speak Japanese. So it's like, I don't know, there's something very, I've always assumed that if I were to go to Japan, that everybody would just immediately know that I wasn't from there.
I think not. No.
Yeah, I had this experience once where I had to go to Taiwan for work once, and I was really surprised that when I was in the airport in Taipei, that everyone just assumed that I was Taiwanese, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah, it's totally. I mean, and I had during this trip, I was in Beijing briefly and also Tokyo briefly, or Tokyo and Osaka briefly. And yeah, that's also a weird moment, being like, no, I don't know. Especially because like that's such a common experience in the US of people assuming you're not from there, and then you being like, I speak English incredibly well, actually, like my whole life is about it. And then to go to a country and for people to assume that you speak the language and be like, I'm so stupid, I can't. You know, like,
I never thought about it that way, the difference. Oh yeah, I just was in my anxiety about like not feeling bad that I didn't speak the language, which I had no reason to be able to speak. But yeah, no, the difference between, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. When I was in China, I just learned how to say like, I was like, should I say I'm American? Because then maybe people will assume I'm Chinese American. But then I was like, should I say I'm Korean? Because then I feel like, because I think then like also you get treated like a slightly different way if you're like a foreigner from another Asian country, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I kind of just like split it. Sometimes I said I was American. Sometimes I said I was Korean.
Oh man.
Yeah. But also like, again though, in Japan and like in Korea, like, I mean, well, I guess maybe this is the thing is like, I think that I was like somewhat easier to pick out in Korea as like not being from there in certain areas because, you know, you go to certain parts of Seoul and like everyone is dressed like not the same, but it's really like weirdly monolithic. And then there are parts of the city that are like everyone is doing their own like weird thing. But like from my experience, at least like in Tokyo, like I was like, oh my God, everyone like has different shoes here. Like that's, you know, which is like, duh, everyone has different shoes, but it was such a change from Seoul. Like, you know, you could just wear whatever the fuck you wanted. I was like, wow, people like, this person has purple hair, and like 40% of my friends have purple hair, you know, but like it was, I just hadn't seen people dressing so individually in a while. I've been in Korea for a few weeks. All of which is to say, like, let's all go everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so before we close, there's one last question that I like to ask everybody, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I was reading maybe I'll stick with this like general Korean literature and Korean American literature trend that I've been on. Something that I read recently that was meaningful to me was this collection of short stories by Oh Jung-hee, who's a Korean fiction writer who is like very established there. I wonder when these stories came out. I think a lot of them were written in like the 70s and 80s. Yeah, 70s, 80s. And so I read some like contemporary Korean poetry by Korean women, and like I'd never read like Korean literature of that period before, of like the 70s and 80s, and it was really fascinating, like what like the idea of Korea as like a nation like in the world, how that like changed over those like few decades. But also the work was there's like a kind of like dark weirdness in Korean women's literature of like the 20th and 21st centuries that was super present in this person's work as well. And it was cool to see that translated over to short stories of that era, you know, like there's some of the surreal elements of The Vegetarian, which I read a few years ago, which I like loved. It was cool to see maybe some connection with this writer who was writing a few decades ago. I guess maybe this is just shows that I'm like that I should go back to grad school or something. I'm like, like tracing the legacy of surrealism in contemporary Korean women's literature is what really gets me going. Oh. But it kind of is.
All right. Well, cool. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Franny's new collection, Soft Science, will be coming out in April 2019 from Alice James Books. And there's a link in the show notes to where you can pre-order it. There are also links to where you can buy her previous collection, Floating Brilliant Gone, and her chapbook, Death by Sex Machine, so do check those out. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechannelopen, or you can send an email to podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. It also gets you access to our subscriber-only bonus content. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. And please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. That does help new listeners find the show. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on September 26th with a new conversation, so be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.